Hello and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. I'm Virginia Prescott from GPB and your host for these talks. Tonight I am talking with Claudio Saunt about his new book, Unworthy Republic, The Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books. There's a link in the chat to the right of your screen, and there's also a link provided on the Atlanta History Center's website. As Claudio and I are talking, please do submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will try to get to as many as time allows. Claudio Saunt is Professor of American History, co-director of the Center for Virtual History, and Associate Director of the Institute of Native American Studies at the University of Georgia. He is author of 3 previous books on Native American history, West of the Revolution, Black, White, and Indian, and A New Order of Things. Claudio, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Well, thank you for hosting, and let me thank the Atlanta History Center for sponsoring this event.
Well, Unworthy Republic challenges the idea that so many histories have presented of the expulsion of Native Americans as an inevitability. And you uncover a lot of evidence of political and economic motivations. So how much land, first, did Indians own in the Southeast in the decades before the 1830s?
They owned a huge amount, half of Alabama, 2/3 of what became Mississippi, about a fifth of Georgia. And it's not just how much land they owned, but how valuable that land was. It was among the most valuable agricultural land probably in the entire world at the time. And removal covered the entire United States. We think of it largely as a Southern story, and it mostly was a Southern story, but there were Indian peoples in the North and Old Northwest who were removed as well. They owned much smaller plots of land by the early 19th century.
Yeah, you do cover a number of other tribes who were also expelled from New York and Ohio. And I know it is different from tribe to tribe and state to state, but generally, what kind of rights or autonomy did Indians have, let's say, in the South?
You're right that it varied, and it was also contested. It's still contested to this day, but they were, until a series of court cases, fully sovereign peoples, with the only limitation being that they could not sell their lands to a foreign power. The Cherokees could not sell their property to France, for example. But in all other ways, they were fully sovereign peoples. They had elections, they had court systems, they had constitutions. So just in the same way as the United States was fully sovereign, so too were they in the early 19th century.
Before the drive to dispossess Indians from their native lands in the 1830s, which is the focus of this book, the prevailing U.S. policy toward Indians, pretty much since the Jeffersonian era, was civilizationist. Can you give us a kind of overview of how Indians lived with that approach?
Yeah, we also call this Jeffersonian Indian policy. This was a federal policy that really existed from the beginning of the Republic right up to the Removal Act. And it was ethnocentric, sometimes well-intentioned, sometimes not. But the ultimate goal for the federal government was to, as you say, civilize these people. That is to teach them English, to turn them into good Christians, to make them farm in the same way as white farmers did, that is with a plow rather than with a hoe, to give up their seasonal hunt, to dress like white people. So in short, in all ways, to turn them into good US citizens. And this was the policy, and it was a policy that Native peoples pushed back on in many, many ways. They also embraced parts of it, and sometimes they did that sincerely, and sometimes they did that strategically in order to kind of make their way in the shadow of the new republic.
Well, the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 was an absolute game changer in that policy. He ran on the promise to solve the, quote, Indian question by pushing Indians west of the Mississippi. This was presented as a humanitarian solution to rescue Indians from extinction. So what evidence did proponents have for this, and how was that framed?
This is a fascinating part of the story, and I should preface this by saying at the outset that Native peoples had been dispossessed of their lands from the first moment that Europeans set foot on the continent, and between the founding of the Republic and 1830, lots of Native peoples were dispossessed, and they lost thousands of acres of their land. But there was no, until the Removal Act, which was passed in May of 1830, there was no formal, consistent federal policy to dispossess Native people. So it really was a significant moment in the history of relations between Native peoples and the United States. But to get this piece of legislation through Congress, the advocates of the policy needed to find allies, and they needed to find allies in the North, and they needed to kind of put up a good front. They couldn't say simply, we want their land in Alabama and Mississippi. Instead, they had to say that this was the best thing for them, and that if you, as a congressman, really cared about Native peoples, if you cared about their welfare and their future, then you would support this policy. So probably the key piece of evidence which they presented and they distributed in the popular press and numerous articles that they planted was that their population, the indigenous populations, were diminishing, and that if they were to remain, they would go extinct. So they pointed to the significant decrease in the Native population, which certainly had occurred between 1500 and the 1820s. Everybody knew that these populations had diminished. But the dynamics of demography are quite complicated, and the best evidence shows that in the early 19th century, these populations in the United States, indigenous populations, were stable and perhaps even growing. Mm. And Native peoples pushed back. They said this over and over again, and they were frustrated that they couldn't get this message out. I found some letters of Cherokees and Creeks writing to Congress or to the president and saying, you keep repeating this over and over again, that we are diminishing, but we're not. We may be small in number, but we are a growing population, and we want to stay where we are.
Yeah, it is the voice of the natives, let's say those who were diplomats printing pamphlets, petitions by the thousands against Indian removal. And it is well known that Indian removal, as it was so genteelly called by Jackson, was his signature policy. But what was new to me was these kind of arguments for and against expulsion, and who was making them. So there was vigorous opposition to Indian removal. Who was aligned in that opposition, and how organized was it?
So obviously the most fervent opposition was rooted in indigenous communities. And that's not to say that Native peoples were unanimous. There were a number of people who just simply wanted to cut their losses. They didn't think that this was a just policy necessarily. But they felt that, in fact, given the tremendous pressure that they were on, and the squatters who were moving in, and the fact that state governments and the federal government were not protecting them in any way, in fact, were encouraging squatters to steal their land and their property. Given that fact, that the best thing to do was to cut their losses and leave. But the vast majority of people, in fact, wanted to stay. They were deeply rooted in the land. There were very practical reasons for why they wanted to stay. And then they also had this kind of deeper connection to the land. As they said, their ancestors were buried here, and they wanted to stay there. So that was the most fervent opposition, as I said, was in indigenous communities. But they did find allies among missionaries who lived among them, and also among church-based groups in the North. And in fact, this was the single most controversial issue to come before the Republic up to that date. And it prompted the first mass petition campaign to Congress. There were thousands and thousands of Americans in the North who drafted petitions, both men and women, and that was novel at the time because women were not seen to be appropriate participants in the political process. But they drafted petitions and wrote these heartfelt and deeply critical petitions to Congress asking that Native peoples to be able to stay in their homelands.
But meanwhile, Southern newspapers were condemning the Northern piety and hypocrisy. You quote a writer from the Georgia Journal, I think from 1825, saying, "If you want to make Indians citizens, Negroes will be next," great exclamation point. And this is really a critical part of your analysis, that the expulsion of natives and expansion of slavery were really intertwined. So how were protections for slavery exposed in the argument that Southerners were making for Indian removal?
Yeah, in so many ways. These two issues were deeply connected, and the first, as we talked about, was that the Native peoples were on this valuable cotton-producing land, the Black Belt, this arc of fertile soil that runs through Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, and runs right through the traditional homelands of the Creek and Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. So planters wanted that land. They had experience with moving people because they had been engaged in first the transatlantic slave trade and then engaged in the interstate slave trade. But also they were used to commanding people and having absolute rights over people of color. And so to have people of color, that is indigenous Americans, living in the South and not under their command, not under their thumb, was an insult to white supremacy. And I think that was also very much a part of their antagonism and hostility to Native peoples.
Right, there were threats to secede. You're disintegrating the Union if you force this on us from the North, and also fiery confrontations in Congress. And then the Indian Removal Act passes in 1830 by 5 votes. Now, this is thanks to the 3/5 clause that gives Southern slaveholders much more power. But these same Southern slaveholders, these planters who championed states' rights, soon realized that they're going to need the Jackson government to forcibly remove tens of thousands of Native people. Did anyone in Jackson's administration question expulsion?
So you're right. This is a great irony that we have these Southern politicians, and the loudest ones in Georgia, who are championing states' rights. But as you say, they need the help of the federal government. They need federal land west of the Mississippi, and they need the federal government to pay for it and to supervise this operation. So there were a few folks, holdovers from the earlier presidential administration, who voiced some quiet opposition to this policy. But Jackson quickly forced them out and appointed loyalists in their place. There were congressmen, certainly, who, in both parties, who opposed Indian removal, but Jackson put a tremendous amount of pressure on them. And there are stories. There was a congressman in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, who who said that Jackson went around and threatened the political careers of these people and said, I'm going to, this is going to be the end of your career if you don't vote for this. It's the single most important issue to me. And the congressman reports, well, this threat was as frightening as the threat of the guillotine. So there was a tremendous amount of arm twisting and wheeling and dealing that went on behind the scenes, and got this act through by a mere 5 votes out of 199 cast in the House. So it really did just barely squeak through. And this was in a Congress that was overwhelmingly Jacksonian.
Mm-hmm. So the Southern planters also needed bankers in New York City and Boston and London, as it turned out, because you trailed the money to bankroll this expulsion. You refer to them as the Northern equivalent of Southern planters. But that is one of the revelations of your book, that following how the money was made and how the money was spent. There's one powerful player that comes up, Joseph D. Beers. Who was he, and why was he and people like him critical to the expulsion?
Yeah, this was one of the most surprising parts of the story, I think, that I stumbled across over the course of my research, and I just kept following these trails. And Joseph D. Beers, or J.D. Beers, as he was commonly called, was probably the central player in Wall Street in financing this operation. And he was born and raised in Connecticut, and moved to New York City in the second decade of the 19th century. And this was when Wall Street was really just kind of emerging as a center of American finance. And so he kind of got in on the ground floor and soon became one of the most important financiers on Wall Street. In the 1820s, he was busy ensuring and financing cotton cultivation in the South. So he knew the South, at least from a distance, and then saw this opportunity emerging in 1830, that he recognized instantly that there was going to be a tremendous amount of extremely valuable land available, and he wanted to get his hands on it. So he formed a joint stock company. He wasn't alone, by the way. Every single major banker in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston was involved in speculating in indigenous lands in the 1830s. They bought vast quantities. I was able to map the amount of land that they bought in Mississippi, and it's right in the most fertile land in the state. And then they flipped it for enormous profits. They earned 10, sometimes 30 times what they had invested in this property. It's interesting that so these financial circuits lead back to Wall Street. They also cross the Atlantic. There are London banking houses that are also speculating and investing in these lands at the same time.
Yeah, it's just this wild period of speculation. Corruption also, certainly. Land companies springing up in the Black Belt, especially for land west of the Chattahoochee River.
Mm-hmm.
53,000 people win the government lottery for access to land appropriated by the state. We're talking about like 4.2 million acres.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw did not want to leave. So what did these millions of dollars in land sales mean for Indians who were still on the land and refusing to leave?
Right, and so the particulars vary from nation to nation, and that's because each treaty was distinct, and it had these kind of legal technicalities that made a difference in how this story unfolded, although the end result was the same. But generally speaking, what happened is that these lands were flooded with hundreds of thousands of dollars and unwilling sellers who did not want to part with their land. And so the game was to separate these people from their land as cheaply as possible, because they knew that they could later flip the land for enormous profits, these speculators. So there were different strategies. they threatened, sometimes they captured Creek Indians, locked them, basically chained them up and said, we're not going to free you until you make a mark on this piece of paper, basically a deed transferring property. Or they beat them. Or they would sometimes seize orphans and then go before a judge who was usually in on the deal, and the judge would say, oh yes, you know, this is on the up and up, so yes, the orphan can sell his or her inheritance for a pittance. They hired impersonators. There were plenty of desperate Creek and Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians at the time who were, some of them were literally close to starvation. And so speculators would show up and say, we'll give you $10 if you go before this judge and say that you indeed are such and such a person, even if you're not. Just make your mark on this piece of paper. Sometimes the same Indian did that literally hundreds of times. So it was just this firestorm of fraud and violence that unfolded. Probably the worst of it was in Alabama, right across the Chattahoochee River. And a lot of the speculators were based in Georgia, were based in Columbus, Georgia.
Well, the stories are just incredible that you tell in the book, you know, surveyors dragging their chains right through somebody's fields, people buying land and building right up or plowing right up to the porch or the doorstep of other people. Some people leaving their homes and coming back and finding squatters in them. It was just a disgrace. But this is a pivotal time, not only in the history of indigenous people in the US, but also for a young republic eager to flex its administrative muscle. And I think one of the triumphs of your book is tracking government accounts showing how woefully incapable it was for that task. Do you have some examples of how those limitations played out?
So it's a tremendous, there were about 80,000 people whom the federal government wanted to deport, which doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot in 21st century terms. But it was a huge operation for a very small, young republic that the federal government had about 8,000 or 9,000 employees, and 7,000 of them worked for the post office. So they were completely overwhelmed with the logistics. They had never been involved in any kind of operation to this extent. It was a humanitarian operation, purportedly, in the sense that they're not moving soldiers around who are cooperating and willingly, you know, moving in the direction you tell them to. I mean, these are families. There are infants. There are pregnant women. There are elderly folks. There are infirm people. And so they're trying to move them hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 miles to the west, over roads that don't exist. They have to build roads on occasion. The maps are atrocious, so they frequently don't know where they're going. They don't have 21st century weather reports, so they get caught in severe winter storms, which lead to just people shivering in the cold for weeks on end. So they are completely overwhelmed by the logistics of it. They simply don't have the capabilities. The other thing is that they don't really care that much at the end of the day. These are not voters, and they're people of color. And so there's a certain disregard, I think, that at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much to most of the federal officials who are involved in this operation that these people are suffering that much. But just to give one quick example, there are well over 1,000 Choctaws who get stranded on the banks of the Arkansas River in 1833, in the winter of 1833. Most of them are shoeless. Most of them don't have clothes to keep them warm. They're just a handful of tents. The steamboats are not where they're supposed to be. There are few supplies to feed these people, and they sit there, some of them sit there for 6 to 8 weeks, waiting for the river to thaw so that they can continue their journey westwards. But that's just one of numerous examples of the failure of the federal government to really to see this operation through in the way that it had promised people in 1830.
Well, there are a number of cogs in this wheel, and we meet a lot of them in your book. It brings a lot of life to it, their accounts, but one of them is George Gibson. He's the head of the removal budget for the War Department. Is a man known to calculate costs to the fractions of a penny, and having precise instructions for his clerks on how to fold up their reports. I mean, you account for a decade's worth of treks, but I believe he is the man who, when somebody, a sympathetic field officer, appealed for funds to help feed these people on the Arkansas River, he said, "It's a disagreeable state of things, but I wish everything must be done to influence their self-reliance." So there is this absolute lack of care, and hundreds of marches, relentlessly grim, made even worse when the Sauk War breaks out in the Midwest, and cholera is carried by soldiers in the Sauk War. I wonder for you, Claudio, doing this research, learning about this misery, where do you go to as a historian when you're reading about this?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stories are really hard to deal with, but it's also astounding to see these records in the federal archives recording all of this, and these records are. You open these boxes and there are these crumbling records of just these atrocious events. So, the challenge of recovering those stories and then presenting them in a way that's kind of understandable and digestible to folks, I think is, one of the things that kept me going and doing the research. So, I mean, it was a depressing project in a lot of ways, but I think an important one. And as I say, I was amazed by the kinds of evidence that was just sitting there in the federal archives waiting for someone to look at. I mean, you mentioned George Gibson, so he's the Commissary General of Subsistence. So he's in charge of supplying troops with food, and if you read through his correspondence before 1830, he's sending so many pounds of beef or pork to such and such a fort here or there to feed troops. He's an old friend of Jackson's. He had known Jackson since the War of 1812, and so it's interesting, as soon as the act passes, Jackson, you would think that this operation would be the responsibility of the superintendent of Indian Affairs, but Jackson takes the authority away from the superintendent and gives it to the commissary general, his old friend. And Gibson, as you said, had this reputation for he was extremely meticulous. He was obsessed with every dollar and every cent, and even to the fraction of a penny. And so he would scour these accounts. There are just thousands and thousands of pages of these accounts in which he's saying, no, we can't, we certainly can't afford this. We shouldn't pay for that. So an Indian agent would write back with an account that would be $83.32. And he would say, you've miscalculated that by a fraction of a penny. Please revise this and send it back. So the astonishing thing is that he's obsessed with this, but he doesn't see the bigger picture. He doesn't really see the human misery that this operation has created, and it's the operation that he himself is overseeing.
So what are some of the things that weren't afforded along the way?
Medicine was one of the big ones, and the people on the ground, some of them were more sympathetic to the peoples they were moving, and some were less. But it's harder to be unsympathetic when you're right there seeing the suffering. So some of these agents would write back and say it's preposterous to move 1,000 people 800 miles with when you have women and children, and to not have any medicine or to not have a doctor. Why would you not pay for a doctor? They write back, and Gibson would respond and say, well, I'm not authorized to pay for that. Or the number of wagons that were available to move folks, or feed to pay for Indian ponies. These were some of the most valuable property that Native peoples had, and the federal government wouldn't pay to feed the animals. Again, Gibson said, we're not authorized to pay for that. He underscored over and over again, economy is the single most important thing here. We are trying to save money.
And yet the people who were deported were, and that's a polite word, were charged for the costs of their deportation. What are some of the things that they were billed for?
Yeah, this is really kind of an awful part of the story. I mean, they have to pay for their own removal, and so the Chickasaws receive a bill, and this goes on and on for decades after the fact. The government's still trying to rectify these accounts, but the Chickasaws receive a bill, I think a decade later, and they're looking at it, and it says, X number of people moved by water, and they write back and say, this is not right. We had only a fraction of people who moved by water, or we had to pay for the rations of so many of this group of people, but they died. They died soon after we set out, and you're still billing us for rations in Indian territory. They are billed for the cost of postage. They are billed for the feed, for the horse of an Indian agent. They are billed for pencils. They are billed for a new bookcase for the commissary general. They are billed for the overtime labor of accountants who are working in Washington, D.C. So every single possible item is added up, and they send the bill to the victims of this operation.
It is really incredible when you see it through that administrative lens. So meanwhile, those who did stay, many exposed to starvation, some even being hunted in the woods for poaching food from their own lands. There is extreme pressure for them to leave. And then things intensify a great deal when the Creek War, or some Creek resistance, certainly the Seminole in 1836 in the middle of the decade. And some people do stay. Paula has a question here. Please elaborate on the experience of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, EBC, I think. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and why they were able to remain on the historic lands in western North Carolina, the Qualla boundary.
Right. So there are some very small groups of people who are able to stay in the South, despite the best efforts of the federal government, and probably they're the Seminoles in Florida, but also the Eastern Band of Cherokees in North Carolina. And the federal government recognizes early on, the Army recognizes early on, that if the Cherokees resist, it's going to be the people who live in the mountains of North Carolina who are going to be the most difficult for us to move. They send in an engineer to scout the region, and he writes back and says, one, these people are determined not to move, and the second thing he says is, there's no way. I mean, these mountains are so precipitous. The foliage is so dense that if we have to send troops here, it is going to be a disaster for us. So a very small number of people, somewhere around 400 or 500, are able to survive by hiding out in the mountains in North Carolina. And what's interesting about this is that by the 1850s, the federal government and North Carolina has lost interest in moving them, which suggests the possibility of a kind of alternative possibility that people could have stayed, that the Cherokees could have stayed. And even as late 1837, there are still negotiations between the Cherokees and the federal government, and there still seems to be a kind of the window is still open, where there's some small possibility that they could still stay in their homeland. So there was nothing inevitable about this story.
Mhm. Right. That is one of your points in the book, that this was not an inevitability, but a political and economic decision. So in the mid 1830s, you have resistors, you have fugitives hunted in swamps, women fleeing, stories of them smothering their children because they can't run. It is just a horrible, horrible story. But also, because of the resistance of the Creek and the Seminoles, it sends a shudder through white planters who by this time are outnumbered by enslaved people in Alabama and Mississippi. So how does that change the U.S. response to expulsion?
Yeah, well, this is really this kind of turning point at the midpoint of the decade, and it really lays bare, I think, what this policy was all about. So there's the pretense in the first half of the decade, in the early years of this policy, that it's humanitarian, that it's philanthropic, that this is benevolent. It's the best thing that we could do to Native peoples. So by the mid decade, the Creeks have said, we don't want to go. Our treaty says we don't have to go. We can stay. We can take our lands in severalty. That is, we can we can divide up our communal lands and hold it as individual landowners. We can become citizens of the state. And the vast majority of them take that option. And this is to the great disappointment of planters who want that land desperately, and to speculators based in New York and abroad. And so the federal government sends in troops to put down the unrest and to force these people out. So this is the Creek War of 1836. And it's a brief but violent war, and it ends with about 1,500 Creek men being marched in chains to Montgomery, Alabama, where they are put on steamboats to head down the river and then over to New Orleans and up river and eventually to Indian Territory. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there is resistance in Florida. This is what we now call the Second Seminole War, which runs from December of 1835 to 1842. And these really become wars of extermination. And I don't use that word lightly. There are federal officers who say this explicitly. It has become a war of extermination. One of them, high-ranking general, writes in private correspondence that says that the Secretary of War wants to exterminate the Seminoles. And the stories are horrendous. These troops are down there for years. It's a malarial environment. They're dying by the score from disease, but they're also chasing down Seminole families. And there are these awful stories of parents, a Seminole family, husband and wife and their 2 children. I remember this one detail. The man is mending his moccasin, and these troops descend on them, and the woman runs with her children, and the troops run and capture them, and then they are put in chains, and we don't know what their fate was at the end of the day, but they were almost certainly moved west.
There's a question here. Can you comment on the extent of, I should make the point that there were also, in some cases, escaped or enslaved people who were fighting with the Seminoles. And this is a related question. Can you comment on the extent of slave holdings by the tribes and the fate of the enslaved blacks in the removal?
Right, and this gets somewhat to your earlier question as well. And the great fear of planters, it's not just that Native peoples are holding onto their land, it's that they're beginning to form alliances with enslaved African Americans. And this is the kind of ultimate fear that there could be an Indian uprising coupled, or that joins together with a slave uprising that can sweep across the South and ultimately turn the entire South, put the entire South in flames. So this is their kind of ultimate fear. The relationship between African Americans and Native peoples is quite complex, and so as this question indicates, there were Indians who held slaves, and there were Indians who used enslaved people to cultivate cotton. And they somewhat resembled white planters across the South. But these folks were small in number. There were also lots of fugitive slaves who had taken refuge with the Seminoles and the Creeks, and smaller numbers with the Cherokees, who had been embraced by Native families and incorporated into these nations. So there was a kind of spectrum of relationships. But I think the single most important thing when we put this in the broader perspective is that enslaved people saw Native communities as potentially places of refuge, and Native peoples saw slaves, at least on occasion, potentially as allies.
I want to just clarify for Pete, who asked a question about rather than civilizing the savages, wasn't the goal of U.S. policy, both before and after Indian removal, to take Indian lands, 1, 2, to eliminate the Indian physical and cultural presence, and 3, extirpate any Indian communities who resisted? I believe that we're answering that question, but Claudio, I didn't know if you had anything to add there.
Well, so when we talk about policy, I mean, I suppose you could step back and suggest that there was some sort of broader, when we say policy, I think we need to be specific about what we mean. You could step back and say there was some broader sentiment that existed from 1500 up to, you could say, the present, which was a desire to eliminate Native peoples, to take their land and eliminate them. But when we talk specifically about policies, about the choices, the political choices that people make, those vary over time. And they are hotly debated. And that's one of the things I really wanted to underscore in my book. This policy, there was nothing automatic about Indian removal. It was deeply, hotly debated. And the petitions that come in from the opponents of this policy say that the future of the Republic depends on what it does to Native peoples. Is it going to abide by its principles that were stated in the American Revolution and in the Declaration of Independence? Was it going to treat all people equally? Or instead, was it going to be more akin to the corrupt, tyrannies that existed in Europe? I mean, they really, truly believed that the fate of the Republic rested on this decision, this political decision that was made in 1830.
It's so moving to see and read some of the things that Native Americans argued for, appealing to the Constitution and liberty and the concept of equality in the book. But I want to move forward before we have to close. Then we find, May of 1836, the Cherokee expulsion really begins in earnest. By the 1860 census, not one Native person living in Alabama. And to go back to your point, a lot of books cover treaties and how the U.S. government backtracked on them, but the cost, again, is one of the things that you talk about here. The U.S. had planned to spend $500,000 to expel these 80,000 people. By your calculation, the government spent $75 million. So that's about $1 trillion today, equal to $12.5 million per deportee. If you could quickly go through how you arrived at that number, what are some of the calculations that you were counting?
Right. Well, so one of the most difficult things is simply to convert from 1830s dollars to the present, and there are multiple ways of doing that. And so, that's the kind of first decision that you need to make. And economists have worked out certain strategies for determining the best way to convert, given the kinds of questions that you might be asking. But the cost the cost to the federal government is relatively easy to determine. And once you go through those calculations, it's just a matter of converting the figures. So but what I think is most important here is not just the cost to the federal government, it's the cost to Native peoples, which I was also able to calculate.
Right, right. You look at per family or household or house, home, family, how much the Chickasaw Creek and Cherokee actually lost. Could you go through those numbers for us?
Yeah, it's equivalent, and the most important thing to take away is that it's equivalent to the net worth of the average American family today. So you can just imagine that all of your family's wealth was wiped out overnight. It's your multi-generational inheritance taken from you literally overnight. Another way to look at this is to look at the value of, say, the Choctaw or Chickasaw land that was taken from these nations. It was equivalent to the capitalization of one of the largest corporations in the United States at the time. So imagine being dispossessed of Amazon. These are relatively small nations, so the Choctaws and Chickasaws have somewhere between 12 and 18,000 citizens each. They are co-owners of this corporation, if we continue the analogy, and it is stolen from them overnight. So this has a kind of, it's your multi-generational inheritance which is stolen from you, but it also resonates for generations and generations when you have that kind of dispossession. And so one thing that strikes me, to come back to J.D. Beers, whom you might remember is this Wall Street financier, his children married into European royalty. Amazingly, his great-great-great-granddaughter died in 1990. And she was extremely wealthy when she passed away. She was married in the early 20th century. It was in the front page of the society papers. She was married, according to the society pages, in front of a mirror that J.D. Beers owned and in front of one of his mahogany tables. So when she died in 1990, her will was disputed and it made it onto into the New York Times. But this just shows you the kind of divergence, these Choctaw and Chickasaw families who are impoverished by dispossession, and how that impoverishment echoes through the generations, and then the wealth that is amassed by people like J.D. Beers. And again, that wealth is passed down through the generations and still exists to this day.
Well, that's the thing, is extremely profitable to some, but so tragically expensive in dollars and in life and in culture to others. And there's the collateral cost here of explosive growth in the domestic slave trade. There's a lot more pressure for more labor in the South that separated families in other regions. So now we have racial reckoning and calls for reparations that are being discussed now by policymakers and citizens alike in ways I think would be unimaginable just a couple of years ago. Have there been any calls for reparations for Indigenous people, and what would that mean?
That's a great question. So there was what was called the Indian Court of Claims that was set up in the late 1940s, 1950s. This was a policy called termination. And so the federal government wanted to basically account for its errors and for the injustice, to pay Native people back, and then to terminate its relationship with Indian nations. So basically to dissolve these nations altogether. This was a failed policy. It was enacted cynically, and no one was satisfied at the end of the day. So that's not how to do it. How it needs to be done, I think, is still an open question, and that's a conversation that Americans have to have with Indigenous Americans. What would what would reconciliation, compensation, what would justice look like? I think that remains an open question.
Well, there's a lot of analysis at the end of this book about the expulsion being the war that slaveholders won. We're a little over time, so quickly, could you answer what that means to you?
You mentioned at some point that the South threatened to secede. And in fact, George Troup, the governor of Georgia, put the state on the brink of civil war with the federal government in the 1820s over this issue. There were letters, op-ed pieces in Georgia newspapers saying, we will meet federal troops on the border, we will defend our homeland, we will defend our slaves, and we will defend our right to Indian land. And so at the end of the day, the federal government backed down. Jackson was in the White House, so there was a more sympathetic figure. So slaveholders pushed this cause until they got what they wanted. And at the end of the day, they did get exactly what they wanted. And what they wanted was to expand across the South, to move slaves from the Chesapeake, from Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina west. Thousands of African-American families were broken up. Hundreds of thousands of slaves were shipped into Mississippi and Alabama, eventually into East Texas. They had visions of taking over the federal government. They had visions of taking over the entire continent to the Pacific coast, and they had visions of taking Mexico and Cuba as well. They thought they were going to rule the world forever. And this was a key step in that process. So it was a war that certainly they won, at least in the short term.
Well, it is a remarkable book. Claudio, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Claudio's new book is called Unworthy Republic, The Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. We do recommend that you purchase it from Acapella Books, a great way to keep the money in the community. We have a load of other talks coming up, virtual author talks coming up. You can go to the atlantahistorycenter.com to see the full schedule. I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks for your time.